So, Joe, in your article, you have a section where you talk about a cure worse than the disease. I think that's very important to discuss because people have asked. It's amazing. The last week and a half, we've tried to be extremely balanced
Mhm.
and to affirm both aspects of this
Mhm.
issue. Number one, the seriousness of COVID-19. Take it very seriously.
Mhm.
Make sure you're taking appropriate steps.
Right.
Obey the governing authorities where they're using wisdom. And you're saying that's righteous, and that is loving my neighbor. I'm going to do all those things,
Mhm.
right? So do those things, right? So that all makes sense to us. But then the other aspect of this is thinking about actually the larger segment of the global community,
Mhm.
not just your parents and your neighbors and your loved ones, but the whole global community that's going to
Right.
be just dramatically impacted by
Yeah.
this. I mean, we have people talking, and this is not conspiracy theory, it's just the numbers. You shut down business for 5, 6 months, you're plunging us into a Great Depression.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
maybe worse than we've ever seen before in at least modern Western history. Who knows what this is going to look like? But you ask those questions, and we need to deal with both those issues. People are saying, okay, well then what's your solution?
Mhm.
What's your solution? And I'd be happy to talk about that, and we're going to
Yep.
we're going to be getting to that. But let's talk about this aspect, Joe.
Mhm.
The cure worse than the disease. President Trump brought that up, and
Yes, I saw that.
he was vilified for
Yeah.
it. Essentially, Joe, it's been this: shut up, shut up. We need to save lives. Don't talk about the future.
Mhm.
Don't talk. Right now, we're saving lives. Don't say things like a cure worse than the disease. Right now, we need to save precious lives. Lock down everything down. And you
Yep.
even mention, is this cure worse than the disease
Mhm.
itself? Oh, you're talking about conspiracy stuff. And somebody accused me the other day of saying that I believe this is a hoax. I thought,
Yeah.
who's ever
Yeah.
said that?
Yeah,
I,
not
I've
right.
never have. I'm asking a question as a minister of the gospel, as a
Yeah.
Christian. How should we really be addressing this in a consistent way? So the cure worse than the disease, Joe.
Well, I'm seeing in the last. It's a great point, Jeff. I've seen in the last few days. Take the British magazine, the Critic, has been raising some very important questions like this now. When you factor in, which is often not discussed, the issue of comorbidities in those who are both getting the disease and dying from it. When you look at differences between the various countries, which are considerable, take Germany or Sweden, for example, over against, say, Italy. When you look at the question of excess mortality. So just to set up an answer to that question of is the cure worse than the disease, in Britain, and I'm using Britain because this is something I was discussing with a couple of doctors today. 150,000 people die on average in Britain every between January and March every year. 150,000. And the Imperial College professor, who Neil Ferguson, who's been doing a lot of public statements on this and has been advising the government, has actually said that a half to 2/3 of the people in the UK who will die during this outbreak would have died anyway. Okay, so that's not being uncaring. This is the person who's been advising the government, and they went and locked the country down in the UK. So when you pose questions like that, the issue is we don't really know ultimately the course of this. All the models that you see talked about they're just computer models. They cannot predict the future because the variables are
Mhm.
so wide, and so top professionals at Stanford, like John Ioannidis, for example, has called the data utterly unreliable. Rosalind Smythe in the UK, professor of child health at UCL, has said that the data in Britain is so misleading it shouldn't even be used.
Hmm.
So when that's the issue, is it possible, you're asking, that could the cure we've got on offer right now be worse? And I think that as my article suggests, I think that the answer to that, especially as we look at the picture globally, could be yes. Just think about some of the things we're doing, just off the top of the head here. The immediate implications of the 2007-2008 crash in the markets led to 2 years of a massive increase in suicides.
Mm-hmm.
So studies have proven that somewhere between 4.8 and up to 6.8 increases in excess mortality through economic suicide during that period. You've got the mental health crisis that's created through anxiety, debt, home foreclosures, all of those kinds of things. You've got the loneliness and isolation of the elderly, which shortens their life expectancy. By the way, in the UK, the average life expectancy is under 80, just under 81 years of age on average. And the average age of those dying with coronavirus at the moment in the UK is 79.5 years of age. So, when you look at that purely in terms of the broader picture, these measures are being taken for a small extension of a very small extension of average life expectancy among some of the elderly, perhaps 1%. If you look at the Diamond cruise ship as a quarantine vessel, as a good example of how many people, what the morbidity is likely to, what the death rate is likely to be, the mortality rate. So when you look at suicide, you look at mental health, you look at the consequences of poverty, you look at the consequences of debt. So your country has just loaded up, is it an extra $2 trillion?
$2 trillion. $2 trillion.
$2 trillion onto the mortgaging of the future. And here in Canada, it's something like 1.7 billion we've just added to the debt, and that's just for starters. The consequences of that, the consequences of unemployment and poverty, it's known to kill millions of people. And what's happening, it leads to the death, an early death of millions of people. And what's happening in parts of Africa right now and Asia, the developing world, some of the Asian countries which are actually handling this better are not moving in this direction. But some of the developing world countries, take India, for example, are copying the West and imposing these lockdown measures. And you've got the migration of hundreds of thousands of people going on, walking hundreds of miles because they've been thrown out of their town.
Out of the city, back to their villages.
Out of their cities.
Wow.
Yeah.
You've got people... my parents had phone calls even today from people in Pakistan where they were missionaries for 17 years saying that they simply do not know what's going to happen. They're saying they're done for. People have got no food. That people in these countries live day to day to go to the bazaar with their small amount of money that they have to buy food. They're shutting everything down. So you're looking at starvation. You've got people being beaten, trying to get to a health facility, with the police enforcing curfews in these places. So the global suffering that's unleashed when we don't take the broader picture into account with these mass lockdowns and basically the destruction of the world economy, and possibly, as you said, moving into some kind of depression. If some of these things aren't lifted soon, I actually believe that the devastation will far outweigh possibly the 1%, and I think that's high based on what I'm hearing from doctors and the data that I'm reading. A 1% of the population, largely from the elderly and those with underlying serious health conditions, to sacrifice the young, their education, their future on this, and the health outcomes, the well-being outcomes for people around the world. I put it this strongly, Jeff. I have a moral problem with it.
Yep.
I have a moral objection to it.
That has been, and it's amazing. This is the first time you and I, Dr. Boot, have spoken in a little while, and that's precisely the point that I've been making.
But you just care about money.
Well, it's interesting because the same principle, I think, applies. What's being wielded as a sword, Dr. Boot, and I'm sure you've seen this, is people say love for neighbor. God commands us to love our neighbor. You're not loving your neighbor. When you question this, when you oppose this in any way, complete lockdown, destruction of the global economy, you're not loving your neighbor. And I stop and I say, did you just hear what you said?
Yeah.
Isn't it contained in everything you're saying? It's okay to shut down businesses, the global economy, plunge people into poverty because I love my neighbor. And so people say, no.
It's the absolute opposite. To raise the questions is to love your neighbor, and to bring this discussion, I think, to the front of the queue right now is the essence of what it means to love your neighbor, especially in the midst of what I would call cynical and nefarious moves on the part of totalitarians and Marxists to advance their agenda under the cover of this crisis. And that's a serious issue in the courts. It's a serious issue in parliaments and senates around the Western world.
And what needs to be understood, Dr. Britt, when you say that, this is not tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist stuff. This is not what it is. If you have read Marx, if you know about the neo-Marxist worldview, if you've listened to these people, if you've read their books, you've read their articles, if you listen to how they respond to these sorts of things, that's part and parcel to their worldview. There are moments like this that are seen as the catalyst to get to that new amazing world that they're looking for. I mean, you even got the governor of California just saying openly, we see this as a tremendous opportunity for a new progressive society, an opportunity now to reshape how we do business and how we have government and all the rest.